The dress was a lie. It was a pale, washed-out yellow, the color of weak tea and disappointment. The fabric, a muslin so thin it was nearly transparent in the candlelight, had been let out at the seams twice before, and the ghost of the old stitches remained, a faint, puckered ladder climbing her ribs. It belonged, in theory, to the upstairs maid, but even she had refused to wear it for 2 seasons. Now, it was Beatrice's, borrowed, a borrowed girl in a borrowed dress. The words of her stepmother, Lady Cromer, clung to her like the chill of the Bath evening. They had been delivered with a dismissive wave of the hand an hour ago, a flick of the wrist that sent Beatrice away from the grand wardrobe of her stepsisters and towards the servantsa pile of cast-offs. Ah, it will have to do. The Duke of Blackmore is not inviting you for your fashion, child. He is simply filling a seat. Do try not to spill anything on it. Or on yourself. Now, standing in the grand entryway of the Duque's rented townhouse on the Royal Crescent, Beatrice felt the lie of the dress more keenly than ever. It was an announcement of her status before she had even spoken a word. Poor relation, charity case afterthought. The other ladies rustled past, in silks the color of jewels and velvets as deep as night. Their gowns whispered of wealth and belonging. Hers stammered an apology. She kept her chin level, a trick her father had taught her. Never let them see you flinch, bah. Dignity is the one thing they cannot take from you unless you hand it to them. Her hands, covered in mended gloves, were clasped at her waist. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over the butleress's shoulder, a polite, neutral expression. Her face had learned to wear like a mask. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. She had learned that lesson years ago, after her father's death had left her stranded in the chilly harbor of her stepmother's care. She had opinions, yes. She knew that the estate accounts Lady Cromer complained of were not merely mismanaged, but actively pilfered by her own wastrel son. She knew that the strain of French in her stepsister Clara's accent was as manufactured as the blush on her cheeks. But these were knowledges to be kept, like pressed flowers in a book, hidden and silent. Her currency was usefulness. She could balance a ledger, draft a letter in a flawless hand, and manage a household with a quiet efficiency that made her both indispensable and invisible. The butler, a man whose spine seemed to have been forged from iron, announced the guests in a voice that could fell a tree. Names of earls and viscounts, of dowagers with fortunes vast enough to alter the geography of the county. Then he paused, glancing at the card she had presented. His eyebrow twitched. A minuscule movement of disdain. Miss Beatrice Ashworth, he intoned, the name dropping into the glittering room with all the fanfare of a pebble in the ocean. He did not add "and family," because her family was already inside, her stepmother and stepsisters having arrived in their own carriage 20 minutes earlier, leaving Beatrice to follow in a hired hackney that smelled of damp wool and horses. A calculated cruelty, ensuring she arrived alone, unchaperoned, another small public underscoring of her insignificance. She walked into the drawing-room. It was a sea of noise and light, of champagne and laughter, pitched a shade too loud. For a moment no one noticed her. She was a ghost at the feast. Then her stepmother saw her from across the room and offered a tight, public smile that did not reach her eyes. It was a smile that said, "See, I am charitable. I brought the poor creature with me." Beatrice inclined her head in a shallow curtsy, the worn muslin whispering its sad, thin song, and moved towards the edge of the room, seeking the safety of the shadows near the brocade curtains. Her plan for the evening was simple. Be silent, be still, and be gone as soon as was polite. She would be a piece of furniture, and furniture is not required to have a brilliant conversation or a fashionable gown. From her vantage point, she could see the host. Nathaniel Vane, the Duke of Blackmore. He was a man made of stillness and shadow. While the room churned around him, he stood by the grand fireplace, a glass untouched in his hand, his gaze distant. He was younger than the gossip suggested, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if it were not so tightly controlled, so shuttered against the world. They said he was drowning in grief for his late wife, who had died 2 years prior. They said his vast northern estate, Ravenshaw, was decaying, the accounts in chaos, the man himself a recluse who had only come to Bath at the insistence of his trustees. He noticed things. Beatrice could see it in the way his eyes tracked the room, not with the predatory sweep of a host looking for social advantage, but with a quiet, unnerving attentiveness. He noticed the slight tremor in an elderly baron's hand. He noticed the false bonhomie of a man clapping another too hard on the shoulder. He noticed the footman who discreetly shifted his weight, his feet aching. His gaze was a finely calibrated instrument, measuring the truth beneath the performance. And then, that instrument turned on her. His eyes met hers across the glittering expanse of the room. It was not a flirtatious glance, not a look of assessment. It was one of quiet, startling recognition, as if he had been searching for the one silent thing in a room full of noise and had found it. Beatrice felt a blush rise hot and unwelcome up her neck. She dropped her gaze to the pattern on the Aubusson carpet, her heart thumping a foolish, frantic rhythm against the cheap muslin. When she dared to look up again, he was gone from the fireplace. The crowd shifted, and she lost him. Relief and a strange, sharp pang of disappointment warred within her. It was better this way. To be noticed was to be judged, and she knew what the judgment on her and her borrowed dress would be. Dinner was announced. A tide of silk and perfume flowed towards the dining room. Beatrice hung back, letting the grand dames and their feathered escorts surge ahead. She would take the lowest seat at the table, the one nearest the kitchens, the one nobody wanted. It was her place. She found the grand dining room ablaze with 1,000 candles, their light glinting off a formidable arsenal of silver. The table was a battlefield of precedence, and she was a foot soldier with no rank. Her stepsister, Clara, flashed her a triumphant smirk as she was seated near the head of the table, beside a wealthy viscount. Lady Cromer was placed to the Duke's right, a position of honor she had been angling for all week. Beatrice located her own place card at the very foot of the oblong table, nestled between a potted fern and a deaf old squire who was already asleep. Perfect. She moved towards her designated seat, her head held high, the ghost of her father's words, a silent comfort, dignity. But, as she reached the chair, a shadow fell over her. She stopped. It was the Duke. He had moved so silently she had not heard him approach. He stood beside her, his presence a sudden, solid reality in her world of shadows. He was taller than she had thought, and the grief that had seemed to make him distant now looked up close, like a profound and terrible exhaustion. But his eyes, a deep, startling gray, were clear and intensely focused on her. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low, a quiet baritone that cut through the clatter of the room without raising its volume. She curtsied, her knees dipping in the worn muslin. "Your Grace." And then he did something that made the entire room fall silent. It was not a grand gesture, not a dramatic pronouncement. It was something small and quiet and utterly seismic. He reached down, took the back of her simple, unadorned chair, and pulled it out for her. A collective, indrawn breath seemed to circle the table. Men did not do this. Not for ladies of rank, and certainly not for a nobody in a borrowed dress. Seated at the far end of the table, a host might give a nod to the ladies beside him. But to walk the entire length of the room to seat an insignificant guest? It was unheard of. It was a statement. Beatrice stared at the chair, then at him. His face was impassive, but his eyes held hers, and in their gray depths, she saw not pity, but a flicker of something else. He had seen her, standing alone in the drawing room. He had seen her stepmother's dismissive smile. He had seen the seating arrangement, a deliberate, public humiliation, and he had, in this one quiet act, countered it. She sat. The worn wood of the chair felt like a throne. "Thank you, "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It is nothing," he said, his voice just for her. And then he added, so quietly she almost missed it, "The end of the table can be a cold place." He pushed her chair in, his knuckles brushing the thin, borrowed muslin of her dress. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the 100 candles in the room. He gave a slight formal bow and walked the long length of the table back to his own seat, leaving a wake of stunned silence and furious whispers behind him. Beatrice stared at her empty plate. The deaf squire beside her snorted in his sleep. Her stepmother from her place of honor was staring at her with an expression of pure, venomous fury. A borrowed girl in a borrowed dress. But the Duke had pulled out her chair. He had walked the length of his world to meet her at the edge of it, and for the first time in a very long time, Beatrice Ashworth felt something other than invisible. She felt seen. The dinner that followed was an ordeal of a different sort. Before, she had courted invisibility. Now, she was the unwilling center of attention. Eyes slid towards her, assessing, questioning. Whispers buzzed at the edges of her hearing like angry bees. What had she done? Who was she? She ate little, her hands steady in her lap. She answered the squire's occasional, shouted questions about the weather with quiet courtesy. She did not look toward the head of the table, though she felt the Duca's occasional fleeting glances like a physical touch. He was, she realized, rescuing her in the only way he could. By ignoring the fuss, he rendered it meaningless. He treated the event as if it were the most normal thing in the world, and in doing so, drained the drama from it. It was a masterful piece of social maneuvering, and it was done for her. When the ladies finally withdrew, leaving the men to their port, Lady Cromer cornered her by the door. What was that?" she hissed, her fingers gripping Beatrice's arm in a painful clutch. Her face, beneath its careful powder, was mottled with rage. "I do not know what you mean," Beatrice said, her voice even. "I do not play the innocent with me, you sly creature. You engineered that. Some pathetic, damsel in distress display. I did nothing but walk to my assigned seat, ma'am. He humiliated me," a Lady Cromer breathed, her eyes glittering. He slighted me, his guest of honor, to make a point of you. You will regret this, Beatrice, I promise you." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. Beatrice merely looked at her, her own expression unreadable. For the first time, the power dynamic between them felt all altered. The Duca's small kindness had been a shield, and a sliver of its strength remained with her. She did not have to wait long for her stepmother to make good on her promise. The next week was a campaign of small, grinding cruelties. Beatrice was given impossible mending tasks, sent on pointless errands in the rain, and subjected to a constant barrage of cutting remarks about her parentage, her poverty, her utter lack of prospects. Clara and her sister joined in with relish, mocking the Duchess of the Sculleria and leaving small, mean-spirited traps for her and inkwell spilled on her ledger. A hem deliberately torn on the one good blouse she owned. Beatrice endured it. She retreated into the quiet fortress of her mind, finding solace in the neat columns of figures, in the household accounts, and the precise, logical world of her father's old law books, which she kept hidden in a loose-boarded chest beneath her bed. Her father had been a solicitor's clerk, a man of letters and laws, not of land. He had believed that a well-ordered mind was the best defense against a disorderly world. He had taught her to read contracts, to understand entails and codicils, to see the architecture of an argument. It was a strange education for a young woman, but it was the only inheritance he had been able to leave her. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive atmosphere of the house, she took one of her father's books to a small public garden near the pump room. It was a dreary gray day, and the benches were mostly empty. She found a sheltered spot and lost herself in a chapter on riparian rights, the clean, cool logic of the law, a balm to her frayed nerves, an interesting choice of reading material. The voice was low and familiar. Beatrice looked up, her heart giving a sudden, sharp leap. The Duke of Blackmore stood before her. He was dressed not in the formal attire of his dinner party, but in a simple dark traveling coat, his hands ungloved. He looked less like a duke, and more like a scholar, his face thoughtful as he glanced at the title of her. Your Grace," she said, starting to rise. Please. Donnet, get up." He gestured to the empty space on the bench. May I?" She nodded, speechless, pulling the edges of her shawl tighter around herself. He sat, leaving a respectable distance between them, but his presence was still overwhelming. The world seemed to shrink to the space of the small wooden bench. "I did not take you for a student of the law, Miss Ashworth," he said, his tone one of genuine curiosity. My father was a clerk," she said simply. He believed a woman should be able to understand the documents that might one day govern her life, a radical notion, and one that had earned her father much scorn. A wise man," the Duke said. He did not smile, but the hard line of his mouth softened. He looked out over the gray manicured lawns of the garden. A wisdom seems to be in short supply these days. There was a profound weariness in his voice that went beyond the social exhaustion she had seen at the dinner. This was something deeper, a weight that seemed to settle in his bones. This was the man of whom the gossips spoke, the grieving widower, the failing duke. But seeing him now, she saw not weakness, but a man holding himself together by a thread of sheer will. An awkward silence fell. Beatrice did not know what to say. The gulf between their stations was a chasm. Then, a gust of wind caught a stack of loose papers on the bench beside him, sending them scattering across the damp gravel. Damn," he muttered, a flash of raw frustration crossing his face. Instinct took over. Beatrice was on her feet in an instant, moving with the quick, practical grace of someone used to solving small domestic crises. She gathered the damp pages, her movements neat and efficient. He knelt to help, his larger hands fumbling slightly with the thin paper. Thank you," he said as she handed him the collated stack. My man of business sent these." "More bad news, I expect," he sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "He insists I review them, but honestly I can barely bring myself to look at them." He was staring at a letter, its page dense with spidery script and foreboding figures. His expression was one of pure, defeated misery. It was the look of a man who knew he was being beaten, but had lost the will to fight back. And that is when it happened. Her eye caught a phrase on one of the pages he held. A legal term? In perpetuity of usufructa. It was an archaic and very specific term related to property rights, but it was used incorrectly here in the context of a debt instrument. It was a flourish, a piece of deliberate obfuscation designed to sound impressive and intimidating to a layman. Her father had called such language a legal peacockina. Without thinking, she pointed. That is wrong," she said quietly. The Duke looked at her, startled. That term, usufruct. It pertains to the right to use and derive profit from a property belonging to another, but not to dispose of the property itself. It has no bearing on a simple loan instrument. It is nonsense here. It is meant to confuse." He stared at the page, then back at her. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, assessing focus. He was seeing her again, but differently this time. Not as a damsel, not as a social curiosity, but as something else entirely. My wife," he began, his voice rough, and then he stopped. He looked away, towards the gray stone of the city. After she died, I lost my footing. The paperwork, the accounts, they felt like an insult. Trivialities, I let things slide. I trusted my man of business, a Mr. Sterling, to handle everything. He looked back at her, and the shuttered expression was gone, replaced by a raw, painful vulnerability. I believe he has been robbing me blind, but he is clever. He buries me in paper, in terms I do not understand. He makes me feel a fool in my own house. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. Beatrice looked at the stack of papers in his hand, then at the haunted expression on his face. She saw the trap that had been laid for him, a web of jargon and forged figures, designed to prey on a man paralyzed by grief. Sterling was not just a thief, he was a vulture. She made a decision. It was bold, it was improper, it was social suicide. But it was right. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. I can help you." He stared at her, a flicker of hope warring with years of ingrained ducal caution. "You? Understand this language," she said, tapping the papers. Uh, uh, Understand the architecture of these documents. It is what my father taught me." She met his gaze directly, her own quiet and earnest. "But I have conditions." The Duke's eyebrows rose. A poor relation, a woman with nothing, was setting conditions for a duke. The sheer audacity of it seemed to shock him out of his lethargy. "Indeed," he said, a ghost of a wry smile touching his lips for the first time. "And what are they?" "A first," she said, taking a point off on her gloved finger. You will tell me the truth. All of it. The full state of your affairs. I do not bargain with half a story. I cannot mend a garment I am not permitted to see in full." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "A second. I will require access to all of your papers. Ledgers, contracts, letters from Mr. Sterling. Everything. Without exception." Granted," he said, his voice stronger now. "And third," she said, her voice softening slightly, "I will not be a ghost in your household. I will not be treated as a servant or a curiosity. If I am to do this work, I will do it as your acknowledged advisor in this matter. My work requires respect, or it cannot be done." He was silent for a long moment, studying her. He saw the worn gloves, the simple shawl, the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her. He saw the sharp intelligence in her eyes, and he saw the steel in her spine. He had offered her a chance to escape her miserable life, and instead of accepting gratefully, she was setting terms. She was claiming her own worth. It was, he thought, the most astonishing thing he had seen in years. He stood up, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt like a duke, again not a title, but a man of action. "A Miss Ashworth," he said formally, but his eyes were warm. Your conditions are accepted. When can you begin?" Beatrice's new life began not in a ballroom, but in a dusty, disused library in the Duca's rented townhouse. It was a cold room, the fire rarely lit, the furniture shrouded in Holland cloths. It felt like the rest of the house, like the Duke himself, a place where life had been suspended. This was the cold house she had to enter, a house made not of brick and mortar, but of neglected duties and weaponized grief. Her first act was to pull back the heavy velvet curtains, letting the watery afternoon light spill across the room. The second was to ask a startled footman to build up the fire. Warmth and light, she thought. One must start somewhere. The Duke had been true to his word. Cartons and deed boxes were brought in, a mountain of paper that represented the vast, complex, and now chaotic state of the Blackmore dukedom. For 2 days, Beatrice simply read. She sat at the great mahogany library table, her hair pinned back neatly, her expression serene, and worked her way through the chaos. Ledgers with entries that trailed off mid-sentence, contracts with hastily scrawled addendums, and letters. Dozens and dozens of letters from Mr. Sterling, full of effusive sympathy, technical jargon, and veiled threats. The Duke, Nathaniel, kept his distance at first. He would appear in the doorway, a silent, watchful figure, observing her as if she were some strange, delicate creature he had introduced into his environment, uncertain if she would survive it. He saw the way she handled the old, brittle papers with a gentle reverence. He saw the neat stacks she created from the chaos, her quiet, methodical progress. He saw her lips move silently as she read, her brow furrowed in concentration. He had expected a helper. He had not expected a scholar. On the third day, he came in and sat in the armchair by the fire, a book, open but unread, in his lap. He simply watched her. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a shared, working, quiet, punctuated by the scratch of her pen, the crackle of the fire, and the rustle of paper. "You are not what I expected, Miss Ashworth," he said into the quiet. She looked up, a small smudge of ink on her cheek. "And what did you expect, Your Grace?" "I am not entirely sure," he admitted. "A frightened mouse, perhaps. Grateful for the cheese." A small smile touched her lips. "I have found that gratitude is a poor currency, Your Grace. It is too easily devalued. I prefer respect." He nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "My late wife, Eleonora, she would have liked you." The words were quiet, a confession. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name to her. She had no patience for fools or flatterers. She used to say the court was full of peacocks, and she would rather have the company of a sensible wren. Beatricia's heart ached for him. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was the heart of this house," he said, his gaze distant. "When she did the clocks all stopped." He looked around the library at the shrouded furniture, the cold hearth he had only just allowed to be lit. "I am only just now realizing I never wound them up again." It was in these small, stolen moments that the true work was done. The ledgers and contracts were the map, but these conversations were the exploration of the territory itself. He began to talk, not just of his wife, but of his father, a cold and demanding man who had taught him that duty was a fortress against the weakness of feeling. He spoke of his guilt, had been in London closing a deal that would have secured the estate for a generation. When Eleanor had been taken by a sudden fever, he had returned to a silent house and a future he no longer recognized. He had made a promise to her memory to protect Ravenshaw, their home, their legacy, and he was failing. Beatrice listened. She did not offer platitudes or easy comforts. She simply listened, her quiet, steady presence a safe harbor for his grief. And as he spoke, she worked. Her mind, trained in the precise and unforgiving logic of the law, began to see the pattern in Stirling's web. It was a brilliant, insidious strategy. He had not committed one large, easily detectable act of fraud. Instead, he had woven 1,000 tiny lies into the fabric of the estate. Small, inflated invoices, falsified interest calculations on legitimate loans, the sale of asset, small cottage here, a parcel of woodland there, for which the proceeds were never fully recorded. And most damningly, he had been systematically creating false debt against the estate, using forged promissory notes bearing the signature of the Duke's late father. He was bleeding the dukedom to death, a death by 1,000 cuts. Her stepmother's campaign against her continued unabated. Lady Cromer, furious at Beatrice's sudden, inexplicable elevation, saw it as a personal affront. She could not comprehend the nature of Beatrice's work for the Duke. Her world, women were either decorative or invisible, and Beatrice was suddenly neither. She assumed a clandestine affair. "Playing the blue stocking now, are we?" she sneered one evening, as Beatrice returned, late from the Duke's house, her mind full of figures. "Do you think he will marry you for your arithmetic? Men like that do not marry their clerks, you foolish girl. They use them and discard them. A borrowed girl in a borrowed dress. Know your place." The words echoed in her mind, a familiar, painful refrain. But they had lost some of their power. Her place, for now, was in that quiet library, bringing order out of chaos. Her place was at that table, a warrior fighting, a battle of ink and paper. One evening, working late, she found it. The linchpin of the entire fraud. It was a contract for the sale of a small mill on the edge of the Ravenshaw estate. The document was dated 3 years prior, shortly after the late Duke's death. It was signed, supposedly, by Nathaniel himself, but Beatrice had spent days studying Nathaniel's handwriting on his personal correspondence. The elegant, slightly impatient slant of his ana, the way he crossed his atas with a firm straight line. The signature on the contract was a masterful forgery, but it was not perfect. The ana was too ornate. The cross on the ata had a slight, almost imperceptible curve. It was the signature of a man trying to imitate another's hand, not the unthinking flow of a man writing his own name. But that was not the true discovery. Tucked into the folded document was a small receipt from the stationer who had supplied the legal paper. It was dated, and the date on the receipt was 2 weeks after the date on which the contract was supposedly signed. The document was a fraud, not just the signature, but the very paper it was written on. It was impossible. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the proof. This was the first thread she could pull that might unravel Sterling's entire tapestry of lies. She looked up. Nathaniel was standing in the doorway, watching her. He must have seen the expression on her face. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with a sudden anxious hope. She held up the two documents, the contract and the receipt. "Your Grace," she said, her own voice trembling slightly, "I believe we have him." That discovery marked the thaw. It was as if a window had been thrown open in the locked room of his grief. For the first time in 2 years, the Duke of Blackmore had a purpose beyond simple endurance. He had a fight to win. The energy in the house shifted. The library became a war room. Nathaniel worked alongside her now, no longer a passive observer. He wrote letters, summoned old family retainers from Ravenshaw, and sent for deed boxes that had not been opened in a generation. A new light entered his eyes. The focused, determined gleam of a commander preparing for battle. The weariness was still there, but it was now the weariness of a soldier after a long march. Not the lethargy of a man waiting to die. He started to see her, truly see her. He noticed the way she chewed on the end of her pen when she was deep in thought. He noticed the faint, floral scent of the soap she used. He noticed the quiet satisfaction on her face when she made a column of figures balance to the penny. He noticed that her presence in the room had become as essential to him as the air he breathed. She was no longer just a solution to his problem. She was the anchor in his storm. One night, they were working side by side, the table littered with maps of the estate and piles of documents. A storm raged outside, the bath rain lashing against the window panes. Beatrice shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Without a word, Nathaniel rose, took the heavy woolen throw from the back of his own armchair, and draped it around her shoulders. The wool was warm and smelled faintly of him, of old books and sandalwood. It was an act of simple, unthinking care, but it felt as intimate as an embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her face turned away from him. "You were cold," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He returned to his seat, but the space between them felt charged. Different. The barrier of their respective ranks of employer and employee was dissolving. A week later, a letter arrived from Mr. Sterling. It was no longer friendly or obsequious. It was cold and sharp. He had clearly been alerted that his affairs were being scrutinized. The letter informed the Duke that, due to pressing and unforeseen circumstances related to other clients, several large, outstanding loans against the Ravenshaw estate were being called in. The total sum was staggering, enough to threaten the dukedom with bankruptcy. He wrote, deeply regretful, but his hands were tied. Payment was due in 1 month. It was a declaration of war. Sterling was done with his slow bleeding. He was going for the kill. Nathaniel read the letter, his face turning a pale, ashen gray. He sank into a chair, the paper trembling in his hand. "He knows," he whispered. "He knows we're onto him, and now he's trying to ruin me before we can expose him." Beatrice came to stand behind his chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "We will fight him, Nathaniel." She had used his given name without thinking. It felt natural. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, almost desperate. The carefully constructed walls of his ducal composure crumbled. "I cannot lose this, Beatrice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is all I have left of her, of my promise to her. This land, this house, it was her home." He turned in his chair to face her, his eyes pleading. "I cannot lose it." And he stopped, his breath catching. He looked at her earnest, steady face, the quiet strength that had become his lifeline. I cannot lose you. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more raw, more desperate, a confession of need. He was admitting that she, Beatrice Ashworth, the poor relation in the borrowed dress, had become indispensable to him. It was a pressured, half-formed confession, born of fear and the sudden terrifying prospect of losing the one person who had made him feel alive again. Beatrice's heart ached. She knelt before him, her hands still holding his. "You will not lose," she said, her voice fierce with a certainty she did not entirely feel. "I will not let you." The threat had landed. The battle was no longer one of stealth and discovery. It was now a race against time. Sterling, true to his word, filed a formal petition of debt with the trustees of the Blackmore estate. He backed his claim with a mountain of documentation, the forged promissory notes, the falsified ledgers, the fraudulent contracts. It was a masterful illusion, a fortress of lies that looked, to the untrained eye, utterly impregnable. A meeting was called in 2 weeks' time. It would be held in the grand assembly room of the Duke's townhouse in Bath. Sterling would be there. The three trustees, a stern old judge, a cautious banker, and a family friend, Lord Harrisaw, would be there. It was not a court of law, but it would function as one. Their decision would determine the fate of the dukedom. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of frantic work. Beatrice and Nathaniel barely slept. They lived in the library, fueled by coffee and a shared, desperate purpose. Beatrice's stepmother, sensing a climax, grew ever more vicious. She forbade Beatrice from going to the Duke's house, a command Beatrice serenely ignored. She intercepted a package for Beatricia, new pair of warm, sturdy gloves, sent by Nathaniel's man, a small practical kindness, and accidentally dropped them in the mud. You are playing with fire, you fool," Lady Cromer had hissed. When he is ruined, he will be ruined, will not remember you. You will come crawling back here, and you will find my charity has run out. Beatrice simply retrieved the gloves and spent an hour cleaning them. Her focus was absolute. She had found the weak point in Sterling's fortress. It was his own cleverness. He had used a variety of forgers to create the documents, but to tie them all together, he had used a specific rare type of ink for all the key fraudulent signatures, including his own attestations. It was a deep, rich, black ink, with a faint, telltale sheen of blue. When it caught the light, she had found the receipt for its purchase among his old expense filings, a single, large batch, bought a year ago. Her plan was simple, and rested on a truth her father had taught her. A lie can be elaborate, but the truth is always simple. The day of the reckoning arrived. It was a cold, bright morning. Beatrice dressed with immense care. She did not have a new dress. She wore her own best gown, a simple, dark gray wool she had made herself years ago. It was impeccably clean, perfectly mended, and it fit her like a second skin. It was a dress that spoke, not of wealth, but of self-respect. When she came downstairs, Nathaniel was waiting for her in the hall. He, too, was formally dressed, his face pale but resolute. He looked at her, and his eyes softened. "You look strong," he said. It was, she thought, the finest compliment she had ever received. The assembly room was arranged like a tribunal. The three trustees sat at a long table at one end. Sterling sat at a smaller table to the right, smug and confident, his solicitor beside him. He gave Nathaniel a look of false sympathy. Lady Cromer and her daughters had somehow secured invitations and sat in a row of chairs against the wall, their faces alight with malicious anticipation. They had come to watch the fall. Nathaniel and Beatrice took their places at a table to the left. Beatrice carried a single, slim portfolio. The proceedings began. The judge, Sir Alistair Finch, a man with a face like a clenched fist, outlined the situation. Sterling's solicitor then began to speak, his voice droning on as he presented the massive claim, referencing the sheaf of documents Sterling had provided. It was an overwhelming presentation, a blizzard of paper designed to intimidate and confuse. Nathaniel sat rigid, his hands clenched on the table. Beatrice laid a calming hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. When the solicitor finished, Sir Alister turned to Nathaniel. "Your Grace, this is a most grave and substantial claim. What is your response?" Nathaniel stood. "Sir Alister, gentlemen, the claim presented by Mr. Sterling is a fraud. The documents upon which it rests are forgeries. To prove this, I will turn the floor over to my advisor, Miss Beatrice Ashworth." A shocked murmur went through the room. All eyes turned to Beatrice as she rose. Sterling laughed a short, ugly bark. His advisor, a slip of a girl who fancies herself a lawyer. "This is absurd." Beatrice did not look at him. She addressed the trustees. "Gentlemen, a complex lie is best defeated by a simple truth." She walked to the table where Sterling's evidence was piled high. With a calm, deliberate hand, she separated the documents into two piles. On one side, she placed the genuine contracts and ledgers. On the other, the forgeries. "Mr. Sterling is a meticulous man," she began, her voice clear and steady, filling the silent room. So meticulous, in fact, that when he set out to create these forgeries over the past year, he used a single special batch of ink to ensure a consistent appearance for the key signature, his own, and those he was faking. She held up one of the forged notes. "This is gallic acid ink with an indigo additive. It gives it a unique blue-black sheen. You can see it if you hold it to the light." Sterling's face had gone pale. His solicitor was starting to look nervous. "He was careful," Beatrice continued. "But he made one mistake. He was not the only one who used this ink. My late father was a solicitor's clerk for 30 years. He used the very same formulation, bought from the very same supplier, in London. He found it was the only ink that would not fade over time." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she opened her own portfolio. From it, she took out a single, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter. "This is a letter my father wrote to me on my 16th birthday," she said, her voice softening for a moment. "He has been gone these 5 years." She placed it on the table beside one of the forgeries. The ink was identical. "And here," she said, taking out another document, "is a household ledger from my father's employer, dated 20 years ago." She laid it down, the same ink. "And here, a property deed he transcribed in his first year as a clerk." She laid it down, the same ink. She looked directly at the trustees. "This ink, gentlemen, has one other peculiar property. It does not change color. The ink on this 20-year-old deed is the exact same shade as the ink on this letter from 5 years ago. It is the exact same shade as the ink on this promissory note, supposedly signed by the late Duke over 3 years ago." She let that sink in, then she turned to the final document in her portfolio. It was another letter. "This letter, however," she said, her voice ringing with quiet triumph, "was written by the late Duke himself. It is a genuine letter. To his son, on the occasion of his marriage. It was provided to me by the Duke's former steward, Mr. Hobbs, an elderly, dignified man standing near the back of the room. The loyal steward Nathaniel had summoned from Ravenshaw gave a firm nod." Beatrice placed the letter on the table. The ink was a faded brown. The late Duke, you see, preferred a simple iron gall ink, one that fades to brown over time. He never used the blue-black archival ink. Not once. She stood back from the table. The evidence was laid bare. On one side, a collection of documents all bearing signatures in a fresh, unfaded blue-black ink that the supposed signatory had never used. On the other, a genuine document showing his true ink, his true signature, faded with time. The lie and the truth. The room was utterly silent. Sterling looked as if he had been turned to stone. Sir Alister Finch picked up the genuine letter, then one of the forgeries. He held them to the light. He looked at the banker. He looked at Lord Harris. No words were needed. It was Beatrice who delivered the final blow. She turned to Sterling, her quiet, earnest face devoid of triumph, filled only with a kind of sorrowful pity. "The crime was not the forgery, Mr. Sterling," she said. "The crime was your contempt. You believed you were surrounded by fools. You believed grief had made a great man small. You believed no one would ever look closely enough. You were wrong. She had claimed her place. She had spoken the truth in the room where everyone else had been content with lies." Then, the old steward, Mr. Hobbs, stepped forward. "I can attest to what Miss Ashworth says," he declared, his voice firm. "I knew the old Duke for 40 years. That is not his signature, and that is not his ink." It was the final nail in the coffin. Sterling's solicitor wisely began gathering his papers, his face a mask of professional retreat. But Sterling himself was not done. He surged to his feet, his face contorted with fury, and pointed a trembling finger at Nathaniel. "He is weak," Sterling spat. "He let his house crumble. He hid from his duties. He doesn't deserve the title, or the land." Before anyone could react, Nathaniel was on his feet. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply stood, and the full quiet authority of his station settled back onto his shoulders as if it had never left. "I was," he said, his voice low and clear, cutting through Sterling's tirade, "a man lost in grief. A failing you, Mr. Sterling, saw not as a human tragedy, but as a business opportunity. You are right about one thing. I was failing. But I am not weak." He turned his gaze from Sterling and let it rest on Beatrice, a look of profound, public gratitude, and something far deeper. "Because a person of true strength and integrity found me in the dark." He walked over to Beatrice's side, and in front of the trustees, in front of her gloating stepmother, in front of the whole world, he took her hand. "Miss Beatrice Ashworth has saved more than my fortune," he declared, his voice ringing with power. "She has restored the honor of my house. Her place is, and will always be, by my side, and any who question that, question me." The declaration hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. It was a public claiming, a shield, a promise. Lady Cromeras's face had gone slack with shock, her mouth slightly agape. The battle was over. The borrowed girl had won the war. Sir Alistair Finch cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice like granite, "I suggest you leave. Now. The trustees will be in communication regarding the legal consequences of this appalling matter." Sterling stared at Beatrice, his eyes filled with pure hatred. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked from the room, a man utterly and publicly destroyed. Not by law, not by force, but by a simple, undeniable truth, spoken by a quiet woman in a mended dress. That evening, the library was no longer a war room. It was a sanctuary. The fire blazed, casting a warm, dancing light over the now orderly shelves. The documents were all packed away. The battle was won. Beatrice stood by the window, looking out at the gaslit street, her heart a strange mixture of triumphant and unsteady. She had done it. She had faced the dragon and won. But what came next? Her work was done. She was once again a woman with no role, no place. She heard Nathaniel enter the room. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. The trustees were effusive in their apologies, he said quietly. "Lord Harris said he has never witnessed such a brilliant and bloodless victory." "The truth is a powerful weapon," she said, not looking at him. "You are a powerful woman, Beatrice." She finally turned to face him. "My work here is finished, Your Grace. I will make my arrangements to leave in the morning." "No," he said. The word was soft, but absolute. "I have no reason to stay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I am your reason," he said. He reached out and gently took her hands. They were cold. "Thank you," he whispered. Her heart sank. It was gratitude. She had known it would be. She had been useful, and he was grateful. She pulled her hands away. "Do not thank me if it is only for the ledgers," she said, the words costing her more than she could have imagined. "Do not offer me a place out of gratitude. I will not be a well-compensated clerk for the rest of my life. I would rather go back to my stepmother's house than live as a monument to your debt, He looked at her, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. It was the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his severe features into something breathtakingly handsome. "Gratitude," he said, a low chuckle in his voice. "My dear Beatrice, I have not felt mere gratitude since the moment you pointed out the idiocy of in perpetuity of usufruct on a damp park bench." He stepped closer, his smile fading into an expression of raw, tender honesty. "The ledgers were the excuse, they were the key that let you into my life. But I was a man in a locked room, and you did not pick the lock. You simply sat with me in the dark until I was ready to find the door myself." He took her hands again, his grip gentle but firm. "I have been a coward, Beatrice, hiding behind my grief, my duty. My wife Eleanor, she was my heart. When I lost her, I thought it was my duty to her memory to feel nothing else, to simply preserve what we had. But you taught me that honoring the dead is not about freezing life in place. It is about having the courage to live again." He looked into her eyes, his own shining in the firelight. "I don't know when it happened. Perhaps it was when you pulled back the curtains in this dusty room. Perhaps it was when you fell asleep over a ledger with ink on your nose. Or perhaps it was that first night, at the dinner, when I saw you standing alone, so full of quiet dignity in your borrowed dress. A single steady light, in a room full of flickering flames. All I know is that my house is no longer cold. My life is no longer silent because you are in it." He paused, his throat working. "I love you, Beatrice Ashworth, not because you are useful, or clever, or strong, though you are all of those things. And because you saw a man, not a duke. You saw a person, not a project." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, blurring his beloved face. "Nathaniel," she whispered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, flat, velvet-wrapped box. He pressed it into her hand. "This is not payment. It is not a gift of gratitude." She opened it. Inside, nestled on the velvet, was not a jewel. It was a folded piece of parchment, a deed. She read the words, her breath catching in her throat. It was the deed to her father's old cottage, on the outskirts of a village in Wiltshire, the home she had been forced to sell after his death. He had bought it back. It was in her name. "A woman should have a place that is her own," he said softly, quoting a sentiment she had once expressed. He then produced a second larger box, "and a dress that is not borrowed." She opened it. Inside lay a gown, of the most beautiful deep blue silk, the color of a twilight sky. It was simple, elegant, and exquisitely made. It was a dress that spoke of love, "something of your own," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To be worn by my Duchess, if she will have me." Through her tears, Beatrice could only nod. He gathered her into his arms, and his mouth found hers in a kiss that was not about passion or possession. It was a kiss that sealed a bargain not of convenience, but of two souls who had found each other in the dark and had the courage to walk into the light together. 6 months later, the Duchess of Blackmore stood on the great stone terrace of Ravenshaw, the Duke's ancestral home. The autumn sun cast a golden light over the sprawling parkland. The house behind her was no longer silent. The windows were thrown open to the crisp air. The sound of servants bustling, and the Duca's cheerful whistling echoed from the library. The clocks were all wound. The portrait of Eleanor, the first Duchess, still hung in its place of honor in the long gallery. Beatrice had insisted. She had placed a vase of late-blooming white roses Eleanor's favorite beneath it, that very morning. The past was not erased. It was honored, given its space to breathe alongside the present. Nathaniel came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. She was wearing a simple riding habit, but he could still picture her in the twilight blue silk. "Ah, the books are balanced, Your Grace," she said, a playful light in her eyes as she leaned back against him. Nathaniel," he corrected her gently, his lips brushing her temple. "It is our life that is balanced now." He held her tighter, his heart full. He looked out over the land that he had almost lost, and at the woman who had saved him from himself. She had come to him in a borrowed dress, a symbol of everything she was supposed to be, temporary, insignificant, a placeholder. But she had refused the role. She had demanded respect. She had offered truth. And in doing so, she had become the one thing in his life that was permanent, essential, and wholly his own. The woman who was meant to be borrowed stayed, and in staying, she had become the heart of everything.